Chapter 1. Trump v. Maddow, The Defamation Showdown. The air in the New York courtroom crackled with tension, thick with the electricity of a trial that had become the defining showdown between Donald J. Trump, the former President of the United States, and Rachel Maddow, MSNBC's firebrand political commentator. The case had captivated the nation, a legal battle that blurred the lines between media accountability, political warfare, and the First Amendment. Cameras flashed as the two figures sat across from each other. Trump, his expression one of righteous indignation, his tie its signature red, radiating the unshakable confidence of a man who had weathered more battles than most could count. Maddow, known for her meticulous on-air dissections of political scandals, now sitting at the defense table, her usual composure slightly frayed, her fingers tapping against the table, betraying an unease she rarely showed on television. Trump had sued Maddow for defamation, arguing that she had knowingly and maliciously fabricated a story, alleging that Trump had routinely used an auto pen to sign laws and executive orders, while simultaneously attacking President Biden for doing the same. The implication had been devastating, that Trump, who had frequently questioned Biden's mental acuity, had himself been unfit for office and had deceived the American public for years. To Trump, this was personal. This wasn't just about clearing his name, this was about his legacy, his credibility, his war against the media establishment that had sought to destroy him since day one. His lawyer, Alina Habba, known for her sharp courtroom presence and unwavering loyalty to Trump, rose with measured authority, addressing the court with a voice that commanded attention. "Your Honor," she began, her words crisp, her tone deliberate, "Miss Maddow knowingly and recklessly disseminated false information, causing irreparable damage to my client's reputation." She took a step forward, turning toward the jury, locking eyes with them, ensuring they understood the gravity of the claim. The so-called evidence presented on her show was nothing more than manufactured hearsay, fueled by a clear bias against Mr. Trump. She let the words settle, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "This is not journalism. This is not truth-seeking. This is propaganda. And we intend to prove that Miss Maddow, in her eagerness to tarnish my client's legacy, ignored facts, manipulated narratives, and misled the American public." Across the courtroom, Maddow's lawyer, Jonathan Greenwald, a seasoned media litigator, rose with a carefully rehearsed smirk, his demeanor exuding the calm arrogance of a man who believed the case was beneath him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth, almost condescending, "this case is nothing more than an attempt to silence the press. Miss Maddow is a journalist, not a propagandist. She has every right to question public figures and analyze their contradictions. That is the role of the free press in a democracy." He turned toward the jury, his confidence unshaken. "What we have here is a former president who, let's not forget, made a career out of attacking the media, calling anything he didn't like fake news. Now, when faced with criticism, he wants to rewrite the rules of journalism." Trump smirked, shaking his head slightly, unimpressed. But Habba was ready. The next few hours were a legal war, each side presenting compelling arguments, battling for control over the narrative. Habba methodically tore through Maddow's broadcast, playing clips where the MSNBC host had confidently stated that Trump routinely used an auto pen, citing anonymous sources that Trump's team argued had no factual basis. She called media analysts to the stand, who testified that Maddow's reporting had crossed the line from speculation into deliberate misrepresentation. But the defense fought back hard, framing Maddow's statements as protected speech, arguing that her role as a political commentator allowed for opinion and interpretation. Trump's team countered with damning evidence, an internal MSNBC email exchange obtained through discovery, in which Maddow's producers acknowledged uncertainty about the claim, but chose to air it anyway. In one email, a producer had written, "We don't have rock-solid confirmation, but it's a great angle. If we couch it as likely, it should hold." The jury shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't about interpretation anymore. This was about intent, and Trump's team had just proved malice. The case had transcended a simple defamation lawsuit. It had become a referendum on the mainstream media, on the boundaries of journalism, on whether the press could be held accountable when it knowingly spread misleading information. If Trump won, it would send shockwaves through newsrooms across America, setting a legal precedent that reckless reporting had consequences. If Maddow won, it would reaffirm the press's broad protections, signaling that even powerful figures like Trump couldn't intimidate reporters with lawsuits. And the jury, now tasked with deciding the future of political media, sat in deliberation, the weight of history pressing down upon them. Trump leaned back, arms crossed, waiting. He had played this game before, and he wasn't afraid to see how it ended. Across the aisle, Maddow, for once, had no monologue to deliver, no script to follow, only silence. The nation held its breath. The verdict would not just define Trump v. Maddow, it would define the battle between power and the press for years to come. Chapter 2. The Trial That Defined an Era. The air in the New York courtroom was thick with tension, an atmosphere so charged that every whispered conversation, every creak of the wooden benches seemed amplified. This wasn't just another defamation trial. It was a moment that could redefine the relationship between politics and the media. The case of Trump versus Maddow had captivated the nation, transforming a legal dispute into a high-stakes battle over truth, accountability, and the limits of press freedom. On one side sat Donald J. Trump, the former President of the United States, his face set in a mask of righteous indignation, his signature red tie perfectly knotted, his presence as commanding in court as it had been in the White House. He wasn't just here to clear his name, he was here to win a war. Across the aisle, Rachel Maddow, MSNBC's most recognizable voice, normally so composed, looked uncharacteristically tense, her fingers tapping against the table as she listened to her attorneys outline their defense. For years, she had dissected Trump's presidency, unraveled his controversies with meticulous precision on primetime television. But now, she was in unfamiliar territory. Here, she wasn't the interrogator. She was the accused. Trump had sued her for defamation, arguing that she had knowingly and maliciously fabricated a story, alleging that he had routinely used an auto pen to sign laws and executive orders while simultaneously attacking President Biden for the same practice. The accusation had been particularly stinging, not just because it framed Trump as a hypocrite, but because it suggested a hidden cognitive decline, a deception that undermined his leadership and legacy. To Trump, this wasn't just a legal battle. This was personal. His lawyer, Alina Habba, known for her fierce courtroom presence and unwavering loyalty, rose with purpose, her every movement deliberate. She knew this case wasn't just about the facts. It was about the narrative. "Your Honor," she began, her voice sharp, confident, slicing through the courtroom silence like a blade. "Miss Maddow knowingly and recklessly disseminated false information, causing irreparable damage to my client's reputation." She turned toward the jury, locking eyes with them, ensuring they understood the gravity of the accusation. The so-called evidence presented on her show was nothing more than manufactured hearsay, fueled by a clear bias against Mr. Trump. She let the words settle, allowing their weight to sink in before delivering the next blow. "This is not journalism. This is not truth-seeking. This is propaganda. And we intend to prove that Miss Maddow, in her eagerness to tarnish my client's legacy, ignored facts, manipulated narratives, and misled the American public." Across the courtroom, Maddow's lawyer, Jonathan Greenwald, a seasoned media litigator, rose with an air of calculated confidence, his smirk barely concealed as he prepared to deliver the counterattack. He exuded the kind of arrogance that signaled he believed this case was beneath him, that Trump's lawsuit was merely another publicity stunt, a sideshow designed to intimidate the press. "Your Honor," he began, his tone smooth, almost condescending, "this case is nothing more than an attempt to silence the press. Miss Maddow is a journalist, not a propagandist. She has every right to question public figures and analyze their contradictions. That is the role of the free press in a democracy." He turned toward the jury, his voice rich with persuasion. "What we have here is a former president who, let's not forget, made a career out of attacking the media, calling anything he didn't like fake news. Now, when faced with criticism, he wants to rewrite the rules of journalism." Trump smirked, shaking his head slightly, unimpressed. But Habba was ready. The trial unfolded as a brutal, high-stakes chess match, a relentless whirlwind of testimony, cross-examinations, and legal maneuvering. Haba meticulously tore through Maddow's reporting, presenting a devastating timeline that exposed the deliberate distortions embedded within her broadcast. She played clips from Maddow's show, freezing key moments where misleading statements were framed as indisputable fact. She called upon legal and media experts who testified that Maddow had blurred the line between opinion and assertion, allowing speculation to masquerade as journalism. Most damningly, Haba presented a crucial internal MSNBC email exchange, obtained through discovery, that showed Maddow's own producers questioning the validity of the AutoPen claim before deciding to run with it anyway. "We don't have rock-solid confirmation, but it's a great angle. If we couch it as likely, it should hold," one producer had written. The jury shifted uncomfortably. The defense had argued that Maddow's statements were legitimate journalistic analysis, protected under the First Amendment. But here was evidence that her own team had acknowledged their uncertainty, yet chose to frame it as fact anyway. This wasn't just reckless reporting, it was intentional misrepresentation. And that was the moment everything changed. The trial had started as a debate over whether Trump's lawsuit was an attack on the free press. Now, it had become something else entirely. It was now a trial about whether the media could fabricate narratives without consequence. If Trump won, it would set a precedent that reckless reporting had legal repercussions. If Maddow won, it would reinforce the near immunity of the press, solidifying the idea that public figures could be scrutinized, even falsely, without consequence. And the jury, now fully aware of the stakes, listened with rapt attention as the closing arguments began. Haba, her voice unwavering, leaned toward the jury. "This isn't about silencing the press. This is about accountability. The First Amendment does not give anyone the right to spread misinformation with reckless disregard for the truth. The press holds power, and with power comes responsibility." She let the moment hang before delivering the final line. "If we allow this kind of distortion to go unchecked, then truth itself becomes meaningless." The courtroom sat in silence. Then Greenwald rose, his posture firm, his voice steady, but there was a tightness in his face, a flicker of unease. The evidence had shaken him. He knew the jury had seen it. He had to shift the argument, fast. "Ladies and gentlemen, my opponent would have you believe that journalism must be perfect, but that is not the standard we apply. Journalism is about questioning power, about presenting multiple viewpoints, about ensuring that no leader, no matter how powerful, is above scrutiny." Miss Maddow did what any journalist would do. She analyzed patterns, she connected the dots, and she presented her findings to the public. The contrast was stark. One argument was about truth. The other was about interpretation. And the jury had to decide which mattered more. Trump sat back, his expression unreadable, waiting. Maddow's gaze flickered toward him, her hands clasped together. And as the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the nation held its breath. This wasn't just about Trump. It wasn't just about Maddow. This was about the very future of journalism, and the verdict would change everything. Chapter 3. The Collapse of Maddow's Defense. Rachel Maddow, once the unshakable voice of MSNBC, now sat under the brightest and most unforgiving spotlight of her career. The confident, incisive commentator who had dismantled countless political figures on primetime television was now the one being dismantled, her every word, every claim, every nuance of her reporting put under a legal microscope. She had always prided herself on exposing deceit, cutting through misinformation, and holding power accountable. But now, she was the one being forced to explain herself, to justify her own words. The stakes were higher than ever, as this was not just about her reputation. It was about the very credibility of the media, the limits of press freedom, and whether journalists could be held legally accountable for reckless reporting. The trial had already captivated the nation, transforming a legal battle into a referendum on modern journalism. In the courtroom, Maddow's legal team argued fervently that her statements fell under the umbrella of protected speech, that her analysis was legitimate commentary on a matter of public concern, and that this lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to silence a journalist who had dared to hold Trump accountable. They painted Trump as thin-skinned, a man unwilling to accept even the slightest criticism, someone who had made a career out of attacking the press, but now wanted to rewrite the rules when the scrutiny turned toward him. They insisted that Maddow had relied on sources she believed to be credible, that she had followed the standard journalistic practice of analyzing patterns and making informed inferences, even if, in retrospect, certain elements of the report may have been flawed. But as Alina Habba, Trump's formidable attorney, began her relentless cross-examination, cracks in Maddow's defense began to show. For hours, Habba worked like a seasoned interrogator, peeling away Maddow's defenses, exposing the inconsistencies in her statements. One by one, she presented the gaps in Maddow's reporting, pointing out the leaps in logic, the assumptions treated as fact, the reliance on anonymous sources whose credibility had never been independently verified. Maddow, who had built her brand on her ability to dissect and analyze others, now found herself trapped in the very scrutiny she had once wielded so effectively. Her legal team struggled to redirect the focus, attempting to shift the argument back to broader press freedoms, but the damage was done. Maddow's composure, once unshakable, began to falter as Habba presented evidence that painted a picture not of a journalist who had made an honest mistake, but of a media figure who had deliberately crafted a misleading narrative. Then came the turning point, the moment that changed the course of the trial. A junior researcher, a nervous young man who had worked on the segment in question, came forward with a confession. Plagued by guilt, he admitted to Habba, in private, that he had been pressured by Maddow's team to find dirt on Trump, even if it meant bending the truth. He revealed that Maddow had known the evidence was weak. She had known the AutoPen claim was speculative at best, but she had pushed forward anyway, eager to capitalize on anti-Trump sentiment, eager to feed her audience exactly what they wanted to hear. When this revelation was presented in court, it sent shockwaves through the courtroom. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Maddow's legal team looked visibly shaken. Her credibility, once her greatest asset, was now in tatters. Trump, seated at his table, smirked, watching the spectacle unfold. He had seen this before. He knew the moment when an opponent realized they had lost, and Maddow had just reached that moment. The confession from her own staffer was the final blow. It was no longer just Trump's word against Maddow's, no longer just a political battle between the former president and one of his fiercest critics. This was now a case of proven deception, of manipulated narratives, of a journalist knowingly stretching the truth to fit a predetermined agenda. Maddow's lawyers, scrambling to contain the damage, tried to downplay the revelation, suggesting that the researcher had misunderstood editorial direction, but the jury wasn't buying it. The mood in the courtroom had shifted decisively, and there was no coming back. Habba, sensing victory, stood for her closing argument, her expression resolute, her voice filled with conviction. She knew the battle had been won. Now, she just had to deliver the final blow. She paced deliberately, her voice steady, letting her words sink into the jury's consciousness. "This case is not about silencing the media," she began. "It is not about punishing journalists for doing their jobs. It is about holding them accountable when they abuse their platform, when they sacrifice truth for ratings and personal vendettas." She turned toward the jury, locking eyes with them, making sure they felt the gravity of what she was saying. Miss Maddow was not misled. She was not deceived. She knew the evidence was weak. She knew the story had holes. And yet, she ran with it anyway. Why? Because it fit her narrative. Because it fit MSNBC's agenda. Because it fit what she wanted to believe. And in doing so, she spread a lie, not just to smear my client, but to mislead the American people. Maddow shifted in her seat, her hands clasped tightly, her shoulders squared but rigid. Her legal team stared blankly ahead. They knew they had lost. The jury knew it too. And in that moment, as Habba took her seat, the only thing left was the verdict. The gallery was silent, the tension so thick it felt like time had slowed. Judge Thompson, after careful deliberation, delivered her ruling. She found in favor of Donald J. Trump, ruling that Rachel Maddow had acted with actual malice, knowingly disseminating false information with the intent to harm Trump's reputation. The words reverberated through the courtroom, and the moment they were spoken, the room erupted. Trump's supporters in the gallery cheered, fists pumping in the air, while Maddow's legal team sat in stunned silence. The ruling sent shockwaves through the media world, signaling that even in the fiercely partisan landscape of modern journalism, the truth still mattered. Outside the courthouse, Trump emerged to the sound of thousands of supporters chanting his name, waving American flags, reveling in the victory. Standing at a makeshift podium set up on the courthouse steps, Trump addressed the nation. "We will not tolerate fake news," he declared, his voice booming, filled with renewed vigor. "We will fight for truth, and we will always win." The chant began almost instantly. Trump, Trump, Trump. A thunderous wave of support that rippled through the city. This wasn't just a legal victory. This was a political moment, a declaration that Trump had once again defied the odds, once again beaten the establishment, once again proven his resilience in the face of relentless opposition. The fallout was immediate. MSNBC executives scrambled to contain the damage, issuing a carefully worded statement that defended Maddow while acknowledging the court's decision. Other media figures watched with growing unease. If Maddow could be sued and lose, who would be next? The press, long seen as an untouchable institution, was now on notice. Trump had changed the game. For years, the media had played judge and jury, shaping narratives, influencing elections, deciding who was legitimate and who wasn't. But now, Trump had flipped the script. He had proven that they weren't above the law, that they too could be held accountable. And as he stood before the roaring crowd, basking in the moment, he knew that this wasn't just a chapter in his story. This was the moment that changed everything. The battle for the White House was just beginning. And the media? They had just learned the hard way. Trump wasn't done yet. Chapter 4. The verdict heard around the world. Judge Thompson, after careful deliberation, delivered her verdict. She found in favor of Donald J. Trump, ruling that Rachel Maddow had acted with actual malice, knowingly disseminating false information with the intent to harm Trump's reputation. The words reverberated through the courtroom, their weight undeniable. For Maddow, it was a catastrophic blow. For Trump, it was the ultimate vindication, a rare moment where the establishment media was held accountable for its recklessness. The ruling sent a shockwave through the political and journalistic world, signaling that even in the fiercely partisan landscape of modern media, the truth still mattered. The moment Thompson's gavel struck the bench, the gallery erupted, a mixture of applause, gasps, and furious murmurs. The trial had been a spectacle, but now it had produced a precedent, a ruling that would alter the balance of power between the press and the political figures they scrutinized. Trump, seated beside Alina Habba, let out a breath, his expression unreadable at first, before a rare smile crept across his face. He nodded slightly, soaking in the moment. Justice, he felt, had been served. For years, he had fought the media, endured their relentless attacks, their skewed narratives, their twisting of facts to fit their agenda. He had called them the enemy of the people, railed against fake news, watched as outlets like MSNBC and CNN systematically worked to delegitimize his presidency. And now, for the first time, one of their own had been held accountable in a court of law. He had won the war of public perception before. But this was a victory not just in the eyes of his supporters, but in the eyes of the legal system itself. Maddow, the once unshakable voice of resistance, had been exposed as a fabricator of misinformation, someone who had placed ideology above truth. This wasn't just a win, it was a reckoning. Outside the courthouse, the scene was electric. The moment the verdict was announced, a throng of Trump supporters erupted into cheers, their voices filling the streets of New York City, waving American flags, holding up signs that read, "Fake news loses," and "Truth wins." It was a scene unlike any other, a courtroom decision that had transcended the legal world and become a cultural moment, a shift in the war between Trump and the media. For Trump, it was more than just another legal victory. It was a moment of absolute affirmation, a signal to every journalist, every network, every media institution that the rules had changed. He stepped out onto the courthouse steps, his presence commanding, his voice ringing with renewed vigor as he addressed the roaring crowd. "We will not tolerate fake news," he declared, his tone triumphant, his signature hand gestures accentuating every word. "We will fight for truth, and we will always win." The chant began almost instantly. Trump, 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 a thunderous wave of support that echoed off the towering courthouse walls. This wasn't just a victory for him. This was a message to the entire media establishment, a warning that the era of unchecked misinformation was over. The fallout was immediate. The verdict sent shockwaves through newsrooms across the country. Networks held emergency meetings, anchors scrambled to spin the ruling, panelists debated what this meant for press freedom, accountability, and the very nature of political journalism. Had the courts overstepped? Had the media finally been held in check? Was this the beginning of a dangerous precedent, or the long-overdue correction of a broken system? Maddow's colleagues rushed to her defense, framing the verdict as an attack on the First Amendment, calling Trump's lawsuit an authoritarian attempt to silence the press. But outside of left-leaning circles, the public saw something else, a moment of reckoning, a rare instance where the press was forced to answer for its distortions. Maddow's employers at MSNBC issued a carefully worded statement, standing by her as a dedicated journalist, while simultaneously acknowledging the court's decision. But the damage was done. Maddow's credibility, once her most powerful weapon, was now permanently tarnished. For Trump, however, the moment wasn't just about Maddow. It was about the bigger picture. It was about taking back control of the narrative. For years, he had been painted as a villain, as a liar, as a danger to democracy. Now, the same media that had attacked him had been exposed as the real manipulators, the real deceivers. And in that moment, Trump had turned the tables. The ruling had shifted the balance of power. If Maddow could be sued and found guilty of defamation, who else in the media would now tread more carefully? What other news outlets, previously comfortable in their unchecked ability to frame narratives, would now hesitate, knowing that they too could be dragged into court for recklessness? The ruling had redefined the playing field, showing that Trump wasn't just a political fighter. He was a man who could make the system work in his favor, even against the most powerful media institutions in the world. He had battled Congress, the courts, the intelligence community, the press, and now he had proven that the battle was winnable. For Maddow, the defeat was devastating. She had spent years attacking Trump, painting herself as a champion of truth, as the woman who stood against authoritarianism. But now, she had been branded with the very accusation she had once hurled at others, spreader of misinformation. Her reputation, once unshakable, was now permanently scarred. Her network, once confident in her ability to drive ratings, now faced a new reality. If they stood by her, they risked further lawsuits, further scrutiny. If they distanced themselves, they risked alienating their core audience. It was a lose-lose situation, and Maddow, for the first time in her career, was out of options. The media world was no longer untouchable. The verdict had rewritten the rules, ensuring that the press could no longer smear public figures without consequence. The decision had sent a message to every journalist, every producer, every editor who thought they could frame reality to suit their agenda. They had to be careful now. They had to think twice, because Trump had proven that they weren't above the law. As Trump left the courthouse, the moment was immortalized. The camera flashes, the roaring crowd, the confident stride of a man who had once again defied expectations. This wasn't just another chapter in his legacy. This was proof that he wasn't done fighting. And, more importantly, he wasn't done winning. The battle for the White House was just beginning. And the press? They had just learned the hard way. Trump wasn't done yet.